Right now, without even thinking about it, you know roughly what time it is. You've checked it probably a dozen times today already. But for almost the entire span of human existence, that was completely impossible. There were no clocks, no hours, no minutes. Time wasn't something you checked, it was something you felt. And the deeper you go into what that actually meant for human life, the more you realize how completely and permanently the clock changed what it means to be human. Let's start at the beginning. Before any timekeeping device existed at all, humans told time the same way every other animal on Earth did, by reading the world around them. The position of the sun, the length of your shadow, the behavior of animals, the temperature of the air. These weren't vague impressions. For people who depended on them, they were precise. A hunter who had spent their entire life outdoors could tell you what hour it was, from the angle of the sun to within about 15 minutes, without a single instrument. We think of this as primitive, but it required a depth of environmental awareness that most modern humans have lost so completely we can barely imagine it. The first deliberate human attempt to measure time wasn't a clock at all, it was a shadow. The gnomon, a simple vertical pole, is the oldest timekeeping instrument ever found. Versions of it appear in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, all independently, thousands of years apart. You placed it in the ground, watched the shadow move, and divided the day by where the shadow fell. Simple, reliable, and entirely dependent on the sun being out. Which meant for most of human history, time itself disappeared whenever the sky turned gray. On a cloudy day, the world literally had no hour. And that was fine. Because before the industrial age, not knowing the exact hour had almost no practical consequence whatsoever. The day wasn't divided into hours the way ours is. It was divided into tasks. You woke when light came. You worked until the heat peaked. You rested when it was hottest. You worked again until dark. The concept of an hour, a fixed, standardized, always the same length unit of time, didn't exist for most of human history. When ancient cultures did divide the day, their hours changed length with the seasons. In ancient Rome, a daytime hour in summer was about 75 of our minutes. That same hour in winter was closer to 45. The hours stretched and shrank with the sun. Nobody found this strange, because time wasn't an abstract grid imposed on the world. It was the world itself, moving through its natural rhythms. The sundial was the refinement of this principle, a gnomon mounted on a marked surface so the shadow's position could be read more precisely. Egypt had them by 1500 BC. Greece had them by 300 BC. But sundials had the same problem as every shadow-based system. They were useless at night, and they were useless indoors, which meant roughly half of any given day was still completely unmeasured. The solution to this problem was water, specifically the water clock, one of the most elegant and underappreciated inventions in all of human history. The clepsydra Greek for water thief worked on the simplest possible principle. Water drips at a predictable rate. Mark the vessel at regular intervals, and you can read time from how much water remains. Water clocks worked indoors. They worked at night. They worked in cloudy weather. For the ancient world, this was a genuine revolution in timekeeping. The Egyptians were using water clocks by at least 1400 BC. Athens had a water clock that ran the entire legal system. Court sessions were timed by how much water drained, and when the vessel emptied, your time to speak was up. This is where something genuinely interesting begins to happen. The moment you start measuring time, you start controlling behavior with it. And the moment time controls behavior, power structures shift. Whoever controlled the clock controlled the schedule, and whoever controlled the schedule controlled everyone who depended on it. This dynamic would play out repeatedly across history in ways that permanently shaped how human societies organized themselves. But we're getting ahead of the story. Because before mechanical clocks arrived, there was one more timekeeping technology that shaped the ancient and medieval world more deeply than almost anything else: the candle clock. Mark a candle at regular intervals. Light it. When the flame reaches a mark, an hour has passed. Simple, portable, and usable anywhere. King Alfred the Great of England reportedly used candle clocks to divide his day into 3 equal parts: 8 hours for work, 8 for prayer, 8 for sleep, making him possibly the first person in recorded history to deliberately schedule his day by the clock. But the problem with all of these systems, sundials, water clocks, candle clocks, is that they required constant attention and constant resetting. They were passive. They couldn't alert you when an hour passed. You had to be watching. The mechanical clock changed this completely, and its invention is one of those moments in history where a single technology quietly restructured almost everything it touched. The earliest mechanical clocks appeared in medieval Europe around the late 13th century, 1280 to 1300 AD, is the rough window historians point to. Nobody knows exactly who built the first one. These early mechanical clocks didn't have faces or hands. They didn't show you the time visually, they just rang a bell at regular intervals. That was the entire point. The word clock itself comes from the Latin cloca and the French cloche, both meaning bell. The clock wasn't named after what it showed, it was named after what it did. It rang. These bell clocks were installed primarily in church towers, which meant the church controlled when the bell rang. And when the bell rang, it told everyone in the surrounding village when to wake up, when to work, when to eat, when to pray. For the first time in human history, an entire community was synchronized to a single external signal rather than to the natural rhythms of the world around them. This sounds like a small organizational detail. It wasn't. Synchronization is the invisible infrastructure of civilization. Without it, you cannot build markets, coordinate armies, run legal systems, or schedule anything at all. Before synchronized time, medieval markets were chaotic approximations. Merchants would agree to meet at noon, but everyone's noon was slightly different depending on where they lived and what shadow they were reading. After the mechanical clock, noon meant the same thing to everyone within earshot of the bell. Commerce could be scheduled, contracts could be enforced, the modern economy became possible. By the 14th century, mechanical clocks were appearing on town halls and market squares across Europe, not just churches, signaling that timekeeping was shifting from a religious function to a civic and commercial one. The Italian city-states of the 14th century were among the first places where clock time genuinely organized daily commercial life. Merchants scheduled meetings by the hour, contracts specified delivery times. The clock had become an economic instrument. But here's where things get genuinely strange. The mechanical clocks of the 14th and 15th centuries were not accurate, not even close. They could gain or lose 15 to 30 minutes per day. Every morning, someone had to check the sundial when the sun came out and reset the mechanical clock to match it. The most advanced timekeeping technology of the age depended entirely on the most ancient one. This changed in 1656 when Dutch scientist Christian Huygens invented the pendulum clock. The swinging pendulum provided a far more consistent and reliable regulating mechanism than anything that had come before. Pendulum clocks were accurate to within about 10 seconds per day, an improvement so dramatic compared to earlier mechanical clocks that it essentially created a new category of precision entirely. And precision changed everything again. Because the more accurately you could measure time, the more valuable time became as a unit of economic exchange. The phrase "time is money" was coined by Benjamin Franklin in 1748 not as a cliché, but as a serious economic argument to a young tradesman about the opportunity cost of wasting hours that could be spent generating income. This was a genuinely new idea. For most of human history, time was not an economic resource. It was simply the medium through which life happened. Franklin's formulation changed that completely. The Industrial Revolution made this transformation total and irreversible. Factory work required workers to arrive at a specific time, work for a specific duration, and leave at a specific time. For the first time in history, ordinary people needed to know the exact hour as a daily survival requirement. Before the Industrial Revolution, most people in the world didn't own a personal timepiece. After it, the pocket watch became one of the most essential possessions a working person could own. The railways accelerated this transformation into something no one had anticipated. Because trains run on fixed schedules, and a train arriving at the wrong time because the station clock was set differently than the one 50 miles away was not just inconvenient, it was lethal. In the United States, before 1883, every town kept its own local time set to its own local noon. There were over 300 different time zones across the country. A single train journey could pass through dozens of them. Railroad companies solved this by creating their own standardized time zones, essentially imposing a single agreed clock on entire regions of the country, whether the local population agreed or not. This was deeply controversial. Farmers hated it. Many towns refused to adopt it for years. The idea that a distant railroad company could tell your town what time noon was felt like an attack on local sovereignty. The United States didn't formally adopt standard time zones by law until 1918, An entire generation of Americans lived through the transition from 300 local times to 4 standardized ones. And then came the wristwatch, which sounds trivial until you understand what it actually changed. Wristwatches were considered feminine accessories before World War I. Men carried pocket watches. Then soldiers in the trenches discovered that pulling a pocket watch out of your pocket while under fire was not practical. And everything changed almost overnight. After the war, wristwatch sales exploded. Within a decade, wearing time on your wrist had gone from feminine accessory to universal necessity. Time had attached itself to the human body. And here is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the more precisely humans could measure time, the more they began to feel controlled by it. And the more they felt controlled by it, the more anxious they became about wasting it. The ancient farmer had no concept of wasting time. They had a concept of work to be done and rest to be taken. The task defined the period, not the clock. But once the clock existed, time became something you could fail to use properly. There's solid research suggesting that cultures with weaker clock time orientation, where events happen when they happen rather than at 3 p.m., have measurably lower rates of certain stress-related disorders. And then the quartz revolution arrived in the 1960s and 70s, and accuracy increased by another enormous factor. Quartz clocks accurate to within 1 second per year, powered by a battery, costing almost nothing. Time that had been owned and controlled by churches, then governments, then railroads, then employers, was now sitting on everyone's wrist for a few dollars. The democratization of time was complete. Then came atomic clocks, accurate to within 1 second every 300 million years. A level of precision so extreme it had no practical value for any ordinary human activity, but it became essential for GPS, telecommunications, and financial markets where timing errors of microseconds have real economic consequences. And then the phone, which didn't just tell you the time, it synchronized itself automatically to atomic time servers and made the idea of your clock being wrong almost conceptually impossible. We have gone from a world where knowing the rough hour required reading the position of the sun with your whole body to a world where a device in your pocket knows the time to within nanoseconds and updates itself from space. And here's what that has done to us that nobody really talks about. We have lost the ability to not know the time, and losing that ability has cost us something real. In 2019, researchers at the University of Virginia found that people left in a room with nothing to do would choose to give themselves mild electric shocks rather than simply sit with their own thoughts for 15 minutes. The inability to tolerate unstructured time has reached clinical levels. Your ancestors who lived before the clock didn't have this problem. They spent entire evenings sitting around fires with no schedule, no alert, no notification, and that unstructured time wasn't empty. It was full of something the modern world has almost no name for. The philosopher Joseph Pieper wrote that leisure, real leisure, not entertainment, is the basis of culture. It's the mental state that produces art, philosophy, religion, and science. Not idle time, not scheduled relaxation, but genuinely open time with no predetermined end. That kind of time has largely disappeared from modern life. Not because we have less of it in total, but because the clock has made every moment accountable. Every gap in the schedule is a gap to be filled. Every idle hour is an hour wasted. The clock didn't just change how we organize time, it changed what we think time is for. For a hunter-gatherer, time was for living. The day happened around you, and you moved with it. For an industrial worker, time was for producing. You sold it by the hour and spent it generating output. For the modern knowledge worker, time is for optimizing. Every minute is evaluated against its potential return. Each of those framings produces a completely different psychological relationship with time, and none of them is the one your body was actually built for. The body you're living in right now was designed by millions of years of evolution to track time through light, temperature, hunger, and fatigue, not through a numbered grid imposed from outside. The circadian rhythm, your body's internal 2 4-hour cycle, evolved long before any clock existed. It runs on light and darkness, not on numbers. And when you force it to run on numbers instead, you pay a biological price. Chronic sleep disruption from misaligned circadian rhythms is linked to increased risk of depression, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, and cognitive decline. The World Health Organization has classified night shift work living on clock time instead of light time as a probable carcinogen. The night shift worker isn't doing anything wrong. They're simply living according to the clock instead of the light. And their body built over millions of years to follow the light doesn't know how to do that without consequences. And then there is the deepest question the clock raises. A question that ancient humans never had to ask because the question itself only becomes possible once you have a clock to ask it with. What is time actually for? Not how should I organize it, not how should I optimize it, what is it for? An ancient hunter-gatherer could not have asked this question. They lived inside time the way you live inside air. They didn't think about it, they breathed it. But once you have a clock, time becomes a thing separate from you, something you are either using well or wasting, something you are either ahead of or behind, something that can run out. The philosopher Martin Heidegger spent much of his career arguing that modern humans experience time primarily as scarcity. There is never enough. It is always running out. And this experience of time as scarcity is, in his view, one of the defining anxieties of modern existence. Ancient humans living by natural time didn't experience time as scarcity. They experienced it as abundance. The day was long. The seasons turned. Time wasn't running out. It was cycling. The difference between cycling time and running out time is not just psychological. It produces fundamentally different civilizations. Cultures organized around cycling time tend to produce different values, different architectures, different relationships with the natural world than cultures organized around linear running out time. This is not an argument that ancient life was better. It wasn't. Shorter, more dangerous, more painful. The clock brought coordination that allowed everything modern civilization has built. But it is an argument for understanding what was traded away in the bargain. Because most of us made the trade without knowing we were making it. And we're living with consequences we haven't fully named yet. Tonight, when you check your phone for the time, for the 40th time, you'll be doing something that no human being who ever lived before the invention of the mechanical clock in the 13th century could have imagined. You'll know the exact time to within a fraction of a second, synchronized to an atomic standard maintained in a laboratory in Colorado, beamed to a satellite 20,000 kilometers above Earth, downloaded to a device in your pocket. And somewhere in the back of that same brain, running on exactly the same biological hardware as the hunter-gatherer who read the sun with their arm, your circadian rhythm is still ticking along, perfectly capable of telling you roughly what time it is by how you feel, if you just got quiet enough to listen. We have built a civilization of extraordinary precision on top of a body that doesn't actually need it. The body was doing fine reading shadows and following the sun. We added the clock for other reasons, economic, military, logistical, and those reasons were real. But the body remembers. Go camping for a week with no phone, no clock, no artificial light. Within 2 or 3 days, your sleep will shift. You'll start waking with the light. You'll start feeling tired when it gets dark. 300,000 years of programming will begin to reassert itself, quietly and without your permission. The sundial, the water clock, the candle clock, the bell tower, the pocket watch, the wristwatch, the quartz crystal, the atomic standard. Every single one of those technologies was trying to solve the same problem. How do you coordinate human activity across people who aren't standing right next to each other? The answer to that problem built the modern world. It allowed factories and railways and financial markets and global supply chains and every other coordinated system that defines contemporary civilization. But the answer also cost us something: the unscheduled hour, the natural rhythm, the ability to simply be inside time without accounting for it. Looking back across the entire arc, from a shadow cast by a stick in the Egyptian sun to an atomic clock synchronized across GPS satellites, the history of timekeeping is really a history of one trade made over and over. Again, precision for presence, coordination for rhythm, control for flow. Each step made the clock more accurate and human life more scheduled. And each step moved us slightly further from the biological time we were built for. The hunter who could read the sun to within 15 minutes without instruments wasn't worse at timekeeping than you are. They were differently connected to time, in a way that was biological, embodied, and deeply human. Tonight, when the sun goes down, you'll flip a switch. Light will flood the room, and you won't think twice about it. But somewhere in your body, running on 300,000-year-old hardware, something will notice that the light isn't right, that the signal doesn't match the sky. that it's time to wind down and your brain won't listen. That gap between what your body knows and what your clock demands is the cost of the most successful organizational tool in the history of human civilization. The clock gave us everything. And it replaced something we haven't fully replaced yet. So here's what I want to know. If you could choose, would you live by the clock or by the light? And do you think you'd actually be happier? Tell me in the comments.